free will does not feel like an illusion. It feels like the most personal thing about us. From the inside, life seems to be made of choices. What to say, what to hide, what to eat, what to believe, whom to forgive, whom to love, even what kind of person to become. And beneath all of this is a quiet assumption that there is someone in here, somewhere, making it happen. That assumption feels almost impossible to doubt, because every day of your life is saturated with a feeling of authorship. You raise your hand because you decide to. You speak because you mean to. You change direction because at some point you choose to. At least, that is how it seems. But some ideas become more unsettling the closer they are brought to experience, and free will may be one of them. So try something simple. Take a moment and name 3 people you admire, or 3 places you would love to visit. Do not search too hard. Just let the answers come. Maybe they arrived immediately. Maybe they came one after another. Maybe one felt obvious, and the next 2 felt uncertain. But notice what just happened. The answers appeared. You may prefer them. You may reject them. You may explain them afterward. But did you choose them before they arrived? Because to do that, you would have had to think them before thinking them. And that is the strange thing. So much of what we call inner life seems to work this way. A thought appears, a memory appears, a desire appears, an anxiety appears, an image appears. Even the intention to act can rise into view before we understand where it came from. And then, almost instantly, the mind begins narrating. It says, "This is what I want, what I meant. This is what I chose, what I decided." But perhaps that is not authorship. Perhaps it is witnessing. Perhaps what we call I is not the author of the next thought, but the witness to the fact that the thought has appeared. A witness to things happening. A witness to impulses forming, preferences surfacing, intentions arriving. And then, only afterward, a storyteller. This does not yet prove that free will is an illusion, but it opens the first crack in the feeling that it must be real. Because if your next thought is not something you author in advance, if it simply appears in consciousness and is only then noticed by you, then the feeling of being the master of your inner life begins to look less like certainty and more like interpretation. That does not make you unreal. It does not make your choices meaningless, but it does make the mind stranger than it first appears. Stranger perhaps than we are comfortable admitting, because what feels most intimate to us, the sense that we are the source of thought, the initiator of action, the unmoved mover inside the mind, may be, at least in part, a beautiful and convincing afterthought. And once that possibility is seen, even dimly, it becomes very difficult to unsee. That is where the real question begins. If thoughts, impulses, and intentions arrive before we claim them, then what exactly is this self we experience as the author of our lives? This question sounds abstract at first, but it becomes much stranger when brought close to experience, because it is not only thoughts that appear on their own, so do moods. You wake up already anxious or already light or already irritated, and only afterward begin telling yourself a story about why. So do desires. A craving appears, a preference, an attraction, an aversion, and in most cases, you are not choosing any of it at the moment it begins. You are finding yourself in the presence of it. And the more closely you look, the harder it becomes to say where any of it truly starts. How do you explain the sudden desire to do one thing rather than another? Why this impulse, and not a different one? What caused this thought to emerge now and not 30 seconds earlier, or not at all? Perhaps a minute ago, you struck your foot on the edge of a table and a flash of irritation moved through you. Perhaps an hour ago, a conversation left you slightly humiliated or slightly relieved. Perhaps yesterday you slept badly and your patience has been thinner ever since. Perhaps a week ago, someone betrayed you, and although the event itself has passed, it has not passed out of you. These things feel as though they belong to the past. But they do not remain in the past. They continue forward. They alter the chemistry of the present. They narrow and widen what feels possible. They tilt attention. They colour memory. They make one reaction easier and another more difficult. Even something as ordinary as what you ate, how long you slept, whether you are in pain, whether you feel safe, whether your body is flooded with stress or calm, all of it enters the next moment with you. And from that next moment, a thought appears, a mood, a desire. And once again, you meet it only after it has arrived. The same is true of attention. Something captures it, a sound, a memory, a fear, a face, a song. And attention moves before you explain why it moved. Even effort, which feels like one of the most personal things we possess, can be looked at this way. At one moment, you have the strength to resist an impulse. At another, you do not. At one moment, discipline feels available. At another, it seems to vanish. At one moment, you are capable of patience. At another, you snap. And when patience appears, when restraint, courage, or resolve appear, did you create these qualities in that moment, or did they also arrive? This is one of Sam Harris's most unsettling observations. People often admit that luck plays some role in life. They say it is luck what you are given at the start. Your genes, your family, your health, your temperament, your opportunities. But then they draw a line. They say, yes, the beginning is luck, but what you do with it is up to you. And Harris's answer is that this is not really true. What you make of your luck is also just more luck. You did not choose your parents. You did not choose the society into which you were born. You did not create the brain that now seems to be making choices. And yet, everything you think and do emerges from an ocean of prior causes. The tools with which you respond to life, your level of discipline, your clarity of mind, your emotional resilience, your capacity to delay gratification, your ability to summon effort in a difficult moment, these too arise from causes you did not author. Even the will to improve yourself depends on a mind that, for reasons not of its own making, became capable of wanting to improve. This is where the idea begins to turn. Because most people imagine freedom as something like independent authorship. There is the world, there are circumstances, and then there is me, stepping in and making decisions from some untouched center. But when you look for that center directly, what do you actually find? You find thoughts, desires, intentions, and emotions appearing. You find reactions taking shape, and then a witness to them, and then, often very quickly, an explanation. This is why the feeling of control can be so persuasive. The story comes almost immediately. So immediately, in fact, that it can seem as though it was there from the beginning. But perhaps the story is not the source. Perhaps it is the echo, not the engine, but the report. Not the author of the event, but the voice that arrives to describe it after it has already begun. This does not mean consciousness is useless. It does not mean the witness is irrelevant. What we notice matters. What we understand matters. What we repeatedly expose ourselves to matters. But none of this requires a magical self standing outside the chain of cause and effect. It only requires a system complex enough to observe itself, react to itself, and be changed by what it learns. That possibility is both humbling and disorienting, because it suggests that much of what we call me may be less like a captain steering a ship, and more like awareness riding inside a vessel already in motion, not separate from the vessel, not powerless within it, but not the original source of the wind, or the current, or the shape of the sea. And once that becomes visible, even for a moment, the old picture of the self begins to loosen. The self as pure chooser, the self as unmoved mover, the self as first cause. These ideas begin to feel less like direct discoveries and more like interpretations layered over experience. useful interpretations perhaps, comforting ones, even necessary ones, but interpretations nonetheless. And that raises a deeper question. If the self is not creating its thoughts from nowhere, if intentions emerge before they are claimed, if effort itself depends on prior causes, then what is the brain doing before the story of I chose begins? That is where the science enters. If the feeling of choosing arrives after thoughts, moods, and impulses have already begun to form, then the next question is unavoidable. What is the brain doing before the story of I chose begins? For a long time, people assumed that conscious intention stood near the beginning of action. First, I decide. Then my brain and body carry out the decision. That picture feels natural. It fits the way life is experienced from the inside. But when neuroscientists began looking more closely, that tidy sequence started to break apart. One of the most famous experiments was conducted by Benjamin Libet in the early 1980s. Participants were asked to make a simple movement whenever they felt like it. To flex a wrist, for example, while watching a clock and reporting the moment they first became aware of the intention to act. At the same time, researchers measured electrical activity in the brain, and what they found was deeply unsettling. A wave of preparatory brain activity, what came to be called the readiness potential, began before people reported the conscious decision to move. In other words, the brain seemed to be getting ready before the person felt that he had decided. That result has echoed through the free will debate ever since. Because if the machinery of action is already in motion before conscious awareness arrives, then consciousness may not be initiating the process in the way we imagine. It may be entering late, not absent, not meaningless, but late. Now, this does not mean Libet single-handedly disproved free will. That would be too simple. Even among scientists and philosophers who take the experiment seriously, there is disagreement about what exactly the readiness potential means. Some argue that it reflects a build-up of general noise or preparation, rather than a fully formed decision already made. Others argue that arbitrary finger movements in a lab tell us only so much about real choices in real life, and that caution matters. Because the point is not that one experiment settled one of the oldest questions in human thought. The point is something quieter, and perhaps more disturbing. Again and again, the brain appears to be doing something important before consciousness tells its story about what is happening. Libet matters not because he closed the case, but because he helped reveal the direction of the evidence. The conscious self keeps showing up later than expected, and once you notice that pattern, it becomes hard not to see it elsewhere. A sentence leaves your mouth, and only afterward do you hear yourself fully understand what you meant. You reach for your phone, and only afterward do you explain why. You recoil from someone, or trust them, or want them, or fear them, and the explanation often arrives after the movement has already begun inside you. Science does not invent this strangeness. It only gives us another way to measure it. This is why Robert Sapolsky's way of looking at behavior is so powerful. He keeps widening the frame. If you want to understand why a person did something, you do not look only at the second before the action. You look at the hour before, the night before, the childhood before, the hormonal state, the stress level, the genes, the culture, the injuries, the habits, the accumulated life. Every action sits on top of layers, and the closer science looks, the less room there seems to be for a little sovereign self, standing outside those layers, freely authoring what comes next. This does not make human beings mechanical in any simple sense. We are not vending machines. We are vastly complicated organisms, with memory and language and anticipation and self-awareness. But complexity is not the same thing as freedom from causation. A storm can be impossibly complex without being uncaused. A forest can be alive with patterns too subtle to predict without being self-created. And the human brain may be like that too. Not simple, not fixed, not easy to predict, but still deeply governed by prior conditions. That is one of the most important things to understand here. Determinism, in this context, does not mean that life is simple. It means that what happens has causes, whether or not those causes are visible to us in the moment. And most of the time, they are not. That is why the feeling of conscious control remains so convincing. Because consciousness does not experience the full causal chain. It experiences the final surface of it, the arriving thought, the forming urge, the sudden intention, the story that follows. And from that limited vantage point, the mind says, I did this, I chose this, I could have done otherwise. But if the brain has already begun preparing action, if the body is already shifting, if emotion and memory and chemistry are already biasing the field long before awareness speaks, then perhaps conscious will is not the starting point. Perhaps it is more like the moment the stage lights come on, after the machinery behind the curtain has already begun to move. This does not mean conscious reflection is powerless. It means it is part of the process, not outside it. Thought can still change behavior. Insight can still change thought. Learning can still reshape the future. But all of that reshaping is itself happening inside the causal web, not above it. And once that is admitted, another question appears. If the brain is preparing action before awareness fully arrives, and if behavior is the visible tip of a much deeper structure of causes, then why would evolution ever make us feel like independent choosers at all? That is where the story widens, and that is where evolution enters. If conscious will is not the unmoved force we imagine it to be, then a new question appears. Why does it feel so real? Why do human beings move through life with such a powerful sense of being authors, choosers, initiators of action? Why this feeling of inner command? One possible answer is simple, because it was useful. From an evolutionary point of view, what matters is not whether a creature sees reality exactly as it is. What matters is whether it survives long enough to pass something on. And for that, evolution does not need to produce a metaphysically free being. It only needs to produce an organism capable of navigating the world, learning from consequences, anticipating danger, pursuing reward, and behaving as if it is the center of action. That last part may be crucial, because to feel like an agent is enormously useful. An organism that experiences itself as the one doing things may plan more effectively. It may remember more selectively. It may learn more quickly from success and failure. It may track its own place in a social world with greater precision. And above all, it may become easier to regulate through stories. Stories about responsibility. Stories about effort, shame, pride. Stories about what kind of person one is and what kind of person one ought to become. These stories may not float above biology. They may be among biology's most sophisticated tools. Stephen Hawking approached the question from a useful angle. If everything in the physical world is governed by lawful processes, then where exactly would this exception called free will appear? At what point in the long history of life would matter begin obeying causes everywhere except inside the human mind? Would it begin with mammals? With primates? With the first nervous systems? With the first creature capable of hesitation? The deeper you follow that question, the stranger the traditional picture begins to look. Because evolution does not seem to need a ghost in the machine. It does not need an uncaused chooser hovering above biology. It only needs organisms complex enough to represent options internally, to model consequences, to experience conflict, and to act in ways that improve survival. And once that is in place, the feeling of authorship may follow naturally. Not as a metaphysical miracle, but as a useful appearance, a kind of interface, like a dashboard in a car. The dashboard is not the engine, it does not create motion, but it presents certain information in a form a driver can use. Perhaps consciousness does something similar. Perhaps the feeling of I am deciding is not the deep source of action, but the form in which a vastly more complex system presents itself to awareness. That feeling may still matter enormously. In fact, It may be one of the reasons human social life became so elaborate. To feel like an agent makes promises possible. It makes regret possible. It makes ambition possible. It makes apology possible. It allows a creature not only to act, but to organize its life around narratives of action. I did this. I should not have done that. Next time I will do better. This is who I am. This is who I want to become. These may not be proof of ultimate freedom. They may be adaptive fictions, or perhaps not even fictions exactly, but simplified ways of tracking a deeper process too complex to feel directly. And once social life appears, the usefulness grows even greater. A tribe, a village, a society must constantly predict behavior. Who can be trusted? Who will cooperate? Who will defect? Who is dangerous? Who deserves praise? Who deserves blame? In such a world, the feeling that people are authors of their actions may become socially indispensable, even if it is philosophically confused. It helps create order. It stabilizes expectations. It encourages self-control. It supports norms. It makes reward and punishment feel intuitive. And from a purely evolutionary point of view, that may be enough, because evolution is not trying to build a wise or compassionate society. It is not trying to eliminate cruelty or produce perfect justice. It is trying to keep organisms alive. And in that kind of world, if someone is dangerous, there may be no time for subtle understanding. Distrust is faster than compassion. Expulsion is faster than rehabilitation. Condemnation is faster than asking what made a person this way. Those reactions may be crude, but they are efficient. And efficiency, in evolutionary terms, can be enough to make a trait endure. That may be one reason the idea of free will grips us so deeply, because it is not merely a private intuition, it is a social technology, a way of making human beings legible to one another, a way of turning behavior into character and character into judgment. This does not mean the illusion was consciously designed. Evolution designs nothing consciously. It preserves what works, and perhaps what worked for creatures like us was not perfect self-knowledge, but the compelling experience of being a self that chooses, a self that could have done otherwise, a self that stands somehow above the stream of causes. But if that feeling evolved because it was useful, not because it was literally true, then much of human life begins to look different. Our pride looks different. Our guilt looks different. Our punishments look different. Even our hatred begins to look different. Because if the sense of being a freely willing self is itself part of the machinery of survival, then many of the moral structures built on top of it may need to be re-examined, not abandoned overnight, but re-examined. And that is where the question becomes painful, because once you stop asking why free will feels real and begin asking what follows if it is not, you are forced to look at human tragedy differently, at cruelty, at violence, at people whose actions seem so monstrous that we want to place them outside the human story altogether. And yet, even there, the chain of causes does not disappear. Behind the cruelest person, there is a history: humiliation, violence, neglect, brain injury, trauma, fear, 1,000 visible or invisible forces accumulating into a life. If we look deeply enough, causes return, and that is where this becomes hardest to think about. That is where pity begins to compete with blame. It is one thing to speak about thoughts appearing, or the brain preparing action before awareness arrives. It is another thing entirely to follow that logic into the darkest parts of human behavior, because most of us are willing to talk about causation right up to the point where it becomes unbearable. We can accept that hunger affects mood, that stress affects judgment, that sleep affects patience, that trauma echoes into adult life. But when harm becomes severe, when cruelty becomes unforgettable, when violence leaves bodies behind it, something in us wants to stop the chain there. We want a final answer, not biology, not history, not circumstance, just evil, just the person, just blame. And the desire for that simplicity is understandable, because some actions are so monstrous that to search for their causes can feel almost indecent, as if explanation were a kind of excuse, as if understanding were betrayal. But this is exactly where the problem of free will becomes hardest, and perhaps most important. Robert Sapolsky returns often to the same pressure point. We are usually comfortable acknowledging causes only when they are obvious enough to force themselves on our sympathy. One of the clearest examples is the case of Charles Whitman. In 1966, Whitman killed his wife and mother, then climbed a tower at the University of Texas and shot at strangers below, killing and wounding many people. Before carrying out the attack, he left a note asking that an autopsy be performed on his brain. He wrote that he did not understand his own thoughts and wanted to know whether something had been physically wrong with him. After his death, examiners did in fact find a brain tumour. Now, this does not mean the tumour explains everything. It does not erase what happened. It does not dissolve the horror. It does not turn tragedy into a neat scientific diagram. But it does something else. It makes causation visible. And once causation becomes visible, our moral emotions begin to shift. Because it is one thing to call a man evil when he appears before us as a self-contained author of his actions. It is another thing to imagine a mass of tissue pressing against the machinery of impulse, fear, aggression, and judgment, while the person himself senses that something inside him is going wrong. That does not make him harmless. It does not mean society should not be protected, but it makes blame less pure, less simple, less satisfying. And Whitman is not unusual because he had causes. He is unusual because one of the causes became visible enough that even those who wanted to condemn him had to look at it. That may be the most uncomfortable insight of all. When the cause is dramatic enough, a tumour, a seizure disorder, a traumatic brain injury, we begin to soften. We say, this person was not fully himself. Something happened to him. Something was wrong. But what if something is always happening? What if there is always a history? Not always a tumour, not always a lesion visible on a scan, but a childhood, a nervous system, a pattern of stress, a field of humiliation, an inheritance of fear, a history of violence, 1,000 small injuries accumulating over time. The man beaten as a child does not leave the beatings behind in childhood. The woman starved of safety does not simply become free of fear because years pass. The person shaped by chaos, neglect, lead exposure, addiction, trauma, deprivation, brain chemistry, social isolation, repeated humiliation, that person carries all of it forward, and then one day a terrible act appears. The act is real, the harm is real, the danger is real. But the act did not arrive from nowhere. That is Sapolsky's deeper point. The causes we can see do not differ in kind from the causes we cannot. They differ only in visibility, and visibility changes mercy. Even judgment itself is not as clean as we like to imagine. In one famous study of parole decisions, researchers found that favourable rulings were far more likely early in a session, and after a food break, then declined as decision-makers grew tired and moved toward the next break. Even the people we trust to judge others are shaped by forces they do not fully see. Fatigue, hunger, stress, cognitive overload, the order in which cases appear. All of this reminds us of something unsettling. The mind that condemns is also a caused mind. A brain tumour gets us to ask questions. A shattered childhood gets us to hesitate. A psychiatric diagnosis makes blame more complicated. But when the causes are diffuse, ordinary, social, developmental, or simply hidden from view, we fall back on the oldest story. He chose it. She chose it. They could have done otherwise. This is one of the reasons determinism feels almost intolerable when brought into the realm of crime and cruelty. Because once you begin tracing causes consistently, the category of the purely self-created monster begins to erode. Not the category of danger, not the need for protection, not the reality of evil as we experience it, but the fantasy of a person who simply authored himself from nowhere and therefore deserves our hatred in some absolute way. And hatred is often what we want. Hatred is clean. Hatred is quick. Hatred lets us stop thinking. Causation does the opposite. It forces thought to continue. It asks what happened before the act. And before that, and before that. It asks what was done to a body, what was done to a brain, what was done to a child, what was absent, what was reinforced, what was normalized, what was injured. That line of questioning can feel dangerous, because we fear that if we understand too much, we will excuse too much. But understanding and excusing are not the same. To ask why a person became dangerous is not to say the danger is unreal. To search for causes is not to deny responsibility in the practical sense. It is only to refuse the comforting illusion that cruelty appears in the world untouched by prior conditions. And once that illusion begins to crack, another question comes into view. If actions arise from causes, and if even the worst among us are shaped rather than self-created, then what should justice look like? Not vengeance, not hatred, not moral theatre. Something else. That is the question waiting on the other side of blame. By the time most people arrive here, a protest has already begun to form in the mind. If no one truly authors themselves, if actions arise from causes, if even terrible people are shaped rather than self-created, then what stops everything from falling apart? What stops people from doing whatever they want? What stops violence? What stops betrayal? What stops cruelty? This fear is not trivial. In fact, it may be one of the deepest reasons people resist the idea that free will could be an illusion at all. Because blame feels necessary. Not just emotionally, practically, socially, almost biologically. Blame feels like one of the tools by which human beings hold the world together. If someone harms your child, you do not want a seminar on causation. If someone lies to you, betrays you, steals from you, or strikes you, the impulse is immediate. Condemn, distance, punish, protect. And all of that makes sense, because long before human beings had philosophies of justice, they had nervous systems built for threat, built to detect danger quickly, built to react before reflection is complete, built to simplify, friend or enemy, safe or unsafe, trustworthy or dangerous. In that setting, blame is not merely an idea, it is a rapid organizing force. It turns uncertainty into action. It allows a group to respond, and that is one reason it feels so indispensable. But there is another reason too. Blame does something psychologically satisfying. It creates a clear moral center. It divides the world into agent and victim, guilty and innocent, wrongdoer and judge. And once that division is in place, our own position feels stable. We know where to stand, we know what to feel, we know whom to hate. This is why the loss of free will can feel so destabilizing, because many people hear it as the loss of moral structure itself. If no one is truly responsible, then no one is responsible for anything. And if no one is responsible for anything, then why not do whatever you want? But that conclusion does not follow, because even in a world without free will, actions still have consequences. Danger is still danger. Suffering is still suffering. A violent person is still a violent person. A predator still needs to be stopped. The difference is not whether society protects itself. The difference is the spirit in which it does so. This is one of Robert Sapolsky's central points. The absence of free will does not mean we stop making distinctions between safe and unsafe people. It does not mean we stop intervening. It does not mean we stop building systems of law, restraint, or prevention. It means that punishment begins to lose its sacred aura. It stops looking like cosmic payback and begins to look more like social hygiene, risk management, containment, and, when possible, repair. Sam Harris makes a similar move from a different angle. He argues that once you see that people do not author the conditions from which their behavior emerges, hatred begins to lose its logic. Not caution, not self-protection, not the need to stop dangerous people. Hatred. That distinction matters, because many people confuse the rejection of free will with passivity, as if to understand a cause were to surrender to it, as if to explain violence were to permit it. But understanding and permitting are not the same. A dangerous dog may need to be restrained even if it did not choose its temperament. A fire must still be contained even if no flame decided to burn. And a dangerous human being may still need to be separated from society, even if his mind was shaped by forces he did not create. The practical response remains. What changes is the emotional and moral story we tell around it. Instead of, "You are evil, and now you must suffer because you deserve to suffer," the story becomes, "You are dangerous, harm has been done, society must be protected, and we must ask what can be prevented, what can be repaired, and what conditions created this outcome in the first place." This feels colder at first, but in another sense it is far more humane, because blame often pretends to be about justice, while secretly satisfying something older and darker, the desire to strike back, the desire to humiliate, the desire to see pain answered with pain. And yet none of that is required to build a functioning society. In fact, some of it may make society worse, because when hatred enters the system, thinking narrows. Prevention matters less than revenge. Repair matters less than symbolic suffering. Understanding matters less than moral theatre. And this is where the fear returns. But won't people still do whatever they want if they stop believing in free will? The answer is that people are already doing what they, in the deepest causal sense, are able to want. The person who refrains from violence does not do so because he floated free of causation. He refrains because something in him, upbringing, empathy, fear of consequences, self-control, socialization, love, habit, biology, made restraint possible in that moment, and if that structure were absent, mere belief in free will would not magically create it. This is one of the illusion's deepest confusions. It imagines that moral order depends on metaphysical freedom. But in practice, moral order depends on causes, on education, on incentives, on environment, on norms, on early attachment, on mental health, on institutions, on what kind of people a society helps to produce. That is where behavior comes from, not from some little king in the skull, issuing commands independent of history. This does not mean blame will disappear easily. It feels too intuitive, too ancient, too useful to our emotions. Even when we understand causation intellectually, our bodies still surge toward condemnation, still want the simple story, still want the person rather than the chain. And perhaps that is why abandoning free will is not just a philosophical shift. It is almost a spiritual discipline, a refusal of the easiest hatred, a refusal of the oldest simplification. Not because distinctions disappear, but because they become harder and more honest. And once that shift begins, something else becomes possible. Not indulgence, not naivety, not the denial of danger. Something rarer, compassion without illusion. If the argument ended with causation, it would feel incomplete, perhaps even unbearable, because to see that thoughts arise, that actions emerge from prior conditions, that even the worst people have histories behind them, can sound at first like a darkening of the world, as if human life were being drained of meaning, responsibility, and dignity. But this is not how Robert Sapolsky or Sam Harris use the idea. For them, the deepest consequence of losing free will is not despair. It is moral clarity. It is the beginning of a different way of seeing other people. Sam Harris makes the point with unusual force. People often believe that luck explains only the beginning of life, You were lucky or unlucky in your parents, your body, your opportunities, your early environment. But after that, they say, what you do with it is up to you. And Harris's answer is that this is not really true. What you make of your luck is also just more luck, because you did not create the tools with which you respond to life. Not your baseline temperament, not your native level of patience, not your threshold for fear, not your ability to delay gratification, not the degree of effort and discipline you are capable of summoning in a given moment. All of that too emerges from prior causes. And this insight, Harris says, is the antidote to arrogance and hatred. That phrase matters because arrogance depends on the fantasy that you authored your gifts in some ultimate sense, that your intelligence is yours in a deeper way than luck, that your restraint is yours, that your discipline is yours, that your success is yours, cleanly and absolutely. But if your strengths also arose from causes you did not choose, then pride begins to soften. Not healthy satisfaction, not gratitude for what is good, but the more poisonous kind of pride. The pride that looks at another human being and thinks, I made myself. Why couldn't you? Hatred softens for the same reason. Because hatred requires a certain picture of the person hated. It requires the image of someone who stood outside all causes, saw the good clearly, and freely authored himself into evil. But the more closely we look, the less often that picture survives. Instead, we find conditions, histories, temperaments, injuries, deprivations, blindnesses, distortions, 1,000 forces converging into a life. This does not make everyone innocent in the everyday sense. It does not erase harm. But it does make cruelty harder to enjoy. It makes humiliation harder to justify. It makes vengeance look less like justice and more like an emotional reflex we inherited from a more primitive world. This is where Robert Sapolsky's moral argument becomes so important. A society can protect itself without hating the people it must protect itself from. It can restrain danger without pretending that punishment is sacred. It can build prisons that are less about suffering and more about prevention, treatment, education, and repair. In that vision, a prison is not a theatre for moral revenge. It is a place society uses because some people are dangerous, or damaged, or both. But the purpose shifts. Not how much pain can we justify inflicting, but how do we reduce future harm? How do we make a person less dangerous? How do we understand what produced this outcome? How do we protect others without turning punishment into a form of worship? This is why some of the most advanced societies have begun, however imperfectly, to move away from purely vindictive models of justice. Not because they believe danger is unreal, but because they understand that helping, treating, educating, and rehabilitating can be wiser than simply condemning. That does not always work. Not every person can be repaired. Not every threat can be transformed. Not every violent mind can safely return to the world unchanged. But even then, the moral center is different. The question is no longer how much hatred is deserved. The question is what response is most honest, most effective, and least corrupted by the ancient pleasure of blame. That may sound idealistic, but in another sense, it is brutally practical. Because once you stop worshipping blame, you begin paying attention to causes. And causes are where prevention lives. Childhood abuse, brain injury, addiction, lead exposure, trauma, psychiatric illness, neglect, isolation, despair. If you care about reducing future suffering, those things matter far more than the theatrical purity of moral condemnation. A society organized around blame keeps asking who deserves to suffer. A society organized around understanding starts asking what makes suffering multiply. That shift does not solve everything, but it changes the direction of thought, and perhaps that is what makes the loss of free will less frightening than it first appears. because what disappears is not meaning. What disappears is a certain kind of moral vanity. The vanity that says I stand outside the conditions that shaped me. The vanity that says I owe my goodness only to myself. The vanity that says other people's failures belong to them in a way mine never could have. Once that vanity weakens, something else becomes possible, a more honest compassion, not the soft compassion that denies danger, not the foolish compassion that cannot draw boundaries, but the harder kind, the kind that can say, "You did not create yourself, neither did I. Harm still matters, protection still matters, consequences still matter, but hatred is no longer the deepest truth available to us." And when that becomes visible, another old human need comes into focus. The need not only to judge, but to explain. The need to turn mystery into story. The need to make sense of suffering, nature, death, and ourselves. If the loss of free will changes how we think about blame, it also changes how we think about something older than blame, our need for explanation. Human beings do not live easily with mystery. We want to know why things happen, why the sky breaks into thunder, why the seasons change, why crops fail, why children die, why suffering visits one house and not another, why we are here at all, and when explanation is absent, story rushes in. For most of human history, the world was full of intentions. There was a spirit in the storm, a will behind the drought, a god in the river, a force in the harvest, a meaning in disease, a watcher above the dead. What could not yet be explained was personalized, not because ancient people were foolish, but because the human mind seems almost built for this. We look for agency everywhere, in faces, movements, accidents, in luck and disaster. A sound in the dark becomes a presence, a pattern becomes a sign, a coincidence becomes a message, and perhaps this too is part of the same evolutionary inheritance. A mind tuned to detect agency too often may survive better than a mind that misses it when it matters. Better to imagine a hidden predator once too often than fail to notice one when it is real. And from that bias toward agency, whole systems of meaning can grow. Gods are born first where fear is strongest and where understanding is weakest. Thunder gets a god, rain gets a god, the sea gets a god, the harvest gets a god, fertility gets a god, war gets a god. The unknown fills with intention, and for a long time this does more than explain the world. It makes the world bearable, because to live in a universe governed by agents is easier, in some strange way, than to live in a universe governed by silence. An angry god can be appeased, a spirit can be petitioned, a ritual can be performed, a pattern can be learned, but pure accident, blind causation, impersonal death, those are harder companions. As knowledge grew, many gods began to recede. We learned what causes thunder. We learned what causes eclipses. We learned why leaves return in spring. We learned that plague is not a curse, and that lightning does not choose its victims. Again and again mystery narrowed, and yet one mystery remained at the center of human life. Death. Not only the fact of it, but the meaning of it. What happens after it? Whether someone is there to receive us, whether justice waits beyond the visible world, whether the self survives its own ending. This may be why the most popular religions that survive to this day so often gather around mortality, because death is where explanation still trembles. It is where the need for authorship returns in its most desperate form. Surely this cannot simply end. Surely a self so vivid cannot vanish. Surely suffering must fit into a larger story. Surely someone is keeping score. When the world is not understood, we populate it with meaning. And even when much of the old supernatural architecture falls away, the emotional need beneath it often remains. Not the need for every old god, but the need for an answer, the need for the world to mean something, the need for our lives to belong to more than accident and decay, and perhaps the idea of free will belongs partly to this same family of needs. Because free will does more than flatter us morally. It places us at the centre of the story. It tells us that we are not merely events in nature, but authors inside it, that our choices emerge from some deeper inner throne, that we are, in the end, not simply caused, but originators. That is an extraordinarily comforting thought. It rescues the self from the stream. It makes us feel less like weather and more like kings. But what if this too is part of the ancient habit of over-ascribing agency? What if the self is not a little god inside the skull, issuing commands into the body? What if it is something stranger, more fragile, more contingent, and more deeply woven into nature than we wish to admit? Then religion, free will, and the need for moral authorship may all begin to look like related attempts to protect us from a universe that does not naturally arrange itself around human longing. That does not make them meaningless. It makes them revealing. They show us what kind of creature we are, a creature who fears death, who fears chaos, who fears being only part of nature, who turns again and again towards stories that make the world feel inhabited, intelligible and just. But if the universe is less personal than we hoped, and if the self is less sovereign than we imagined, then the final question becomes unavoidable. How should one live under that knowledge? Not in theory, not in argument, but tomorrow. Why get up? Why act? Why love? Why try? By this point, one final objection usually remains. If there is no free will, then why do anything? Why get out of bed? Why try to improve yourself? Why struggle, or work, or love, or resist temptation, or build anything at all? If everything is caused, if even effort arises from prior conditions, if the self is more witness than sovereign, then what becomes of action? At first, this question can sound devastating, but it may conceal a confusion. Because even if free will, in the deepest traditional sense, does not exist, life does not stop. Thoughts still arise, desires still arise, hunger still arrives, boredom still arrives, restlessness still arrives, curiosity appears, fear appears, affection appears, pain appears, hope appears, and from these, action continues. You do not need a little God inside the mind in order for life to move. It is already moving. Even the desire to do nothing is itself just another appearance in consciousness. And if you tried to sit perfectly still, doing nothing at all, for as long as possible, something would eventually appear. A thought, an itch, a memory, a discomfort, an impulse to stand, an impulse to check the time, an impulse to eat, an impulse to begin again, and then action would continue. Not because you stepped outside causation, but because causation never stopped. This is important to see. The absence of free will is not the absence of movement. It is not the absence of effort. It is not the absence of meaning. It is the absence of a certain fantasy, that somewhere inside you there is an uncaused author standing apart from the whole procession of life. Once that fantasy falls away, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is process, a living process, a conscious process, a process that can learn, suffer, adapt, reflect, and be changed by what it sees, and that is enough for life to matter. In fact, it may be the only way life ever mattered, because meaning was never hiding in metaphysical independence. It was always here, in experience, in relationship, in suffering, in beauty, in the reduction of harm, in the deepening of understanding, in the strange fact that one conscious life can affect another. You do not need free will in the impossible sense to love your child. You do not need it to tell the truth. You do not need it to become gentler. You do not need it to build better habits, or better institutions, or a less cruel society. All of that still happens through causes, But causes can include insight. They can include education. They can include reflection. They can include new environments, new relationships, new ways of seeing. To understand yourself more deeply is itself a cause. To see what anger is made of can change the next moment of anger. To see what shame is made of can alter the next movement of shame. To understand what shaped you is not to stand outside that shaping. It is to become part of how the future changes. And perhaps this is the closest thing to freedom that was ever really available to us. Not freedom from causes, but freedom through understanding them. Not the fantasy of being self-created, but the humility of seeing clearly. Not a soul hovering above nature, but a mind within nature becoming more honest about what it is. That kind of freedom is quieter. It offers less vanity, less self-congratulation, less hatred, but perhaps it offers something better. It offers relief. Relief from the impossible burden of having to be your own first cause. Relief from the fantasy that you should have been able to author yourself from nothing. Relief from certain forms of shame and certain forms of arrogance. And perhaps, too, it offers compassion. Because once you see that you did not build yourself from raw emptiness, it becomes harder to look at another person and imagine that they did. This does not erase boundaries. It does not erase pain. It does not erase justice or danger or consequence, but it changes the atmosphere in which these are held. Less condemnation, more understanding, less metaphysical pride, more honesty, less hatred, more grief. And perhaps, in the end, that is what the loss of free will really gives us. Not passivity, not despair, but a more accurate tenderness toward the human condition. We are not self-created beings standing outside the universe, issuing commands into our lives. We are part of the universe, shaped by it, moved through it, capable of awareness within it, and that awareness, though not sovereign, is still extraordinary. It can notice itself. It can notice suffering. It can notice the causes of suffering. And in noticing, it can become part of what changes. So the question is not really why do anything. The real question is this. Now that you see more clearly how deeply life shapes thought, choice, character, and fate, what do you want to become? Now that you see more clearly what shapes a human life, that may not be the old freedom, but it is enough, and it may be the beginning of something wiser.